So a purpose in the club. So what do we need to understand, to have, to learn, to do in order for our track to have a purpose in the club? We need to have an understanding of the dance floor function of a song. Without understanding how songs work in the club, how songs work in the context of a DJ set, it's you're kind of flying blind, right? You can kind of guess at what might work. You can guess at how music functions in the context of the club, but if you don't kind of like unpack it and internalize it, then delivering on all of this stuff is really difficult to do, right? We want it to be structured in a DJ friendly way. So there are certain aspects of how we begin a track, how we end a track, how the changes happen sequentially throughout the course of a piece of music that can make it easier or more difficult for a DJ to play it alongside of the songs, right? DJs, well, unless we're talking about kind of like a reggae sound system or something like that, like for the most part, when we're talking about dance music, we're not talking about a DJ plays a track from the start to the end, and then there's a pause, and then they start the next track from the beginning, and then it plays all the way to the end, right? There's this overlapping aspect of continuous music, and there are these structural aspects that we need to incorporate into our music in order to make our tracks fit nicely alongside of the tracks. And then the third aspect of what we need to do is to use the energy levels of our track. Obviously, I'll dig into this later, but this is kind of about how the intensity of a piece of music changes or doesn't change over time. We will dig into how you can use that to feed into this kind of idea of the dance floor purpose, how all of this stuff kind of like ties together. So purpose then. Dance music, perhaps more than any other type of popular music, is really determined by its purpose. The purpose being to make people dance. And that means that to be as successful as dance music producers, we need to consider how our track's going to make people dance. And like I said before, a prerequisite of making people dance is getting played. So we're thinking in terms of what are people on the dance floor going to respond to, and what is the person in the DJ booth going to need in order to make the decision to play a certain piece of music over another piece of music. Now, this kind of idea of understanding the purpose, we're talking about like what role is our piece of music? What is it achieving for the DJ? And when it comes to figuring that out, you don't need to have that set in stone in your head before you start making anything. You can do that. But this is not about being really prescriptive and saying, okay, I'm going to make a hard hitting techno track. It's going to be 140 BPM. I'm going to have 4 on the floor kick drum, and there's going to be a 32 bar breakdown in the middle, and it's going to be 6.5 minutes long or something like that, right? We're not kind of like being highly rigid and prescriptive about what it is that we're going to make before we make it. You can do that. That's an entirely valid way of working. But what we're talking about here is being responsive to the musical material that you're interested in creating and finding a way to make that into an intentional design that is going to show all your ideas and your creativity off in the best possible light. So with that in mind, you do need to figure out this purpose before you arrange your song, right? So it doesn't need to be before you do anything, but when you get to the point where, okay, now I need to figure out how these musical ideas are going to be arranged throughout the course of the track, if you don't have your purpose already not set in stone necessarily, but if you don't already have a purpose in mind before you start arranging the song, then your arrangement isn't going, you're not going to be making decisions that make your arrangement fulfill that purpose that you're setting out to fulfill. Okay, the arrangement is a really important part of how a piece of music fulfills a particular purpose. So we need to have an idea of what that purpose is before we start the arrangement. Hopefully that makes sense. So how do DJs use songs? There are a myriad of different ways, right? But something that we can do in order to be able to kind of like figure this out for ourselves is we can look at existing pieces of music and look at how they're constructed, what rules do they follow, what rules do they not follow, and start to think about, okay, well, how does this piece of music function? What is the purpose of this inside of a DJ set? We can listen to DJs, we can listen to finished tracks, and start to kind of like triangulate and hone in on different purposes that tracks are used for in the club. So I'm going to kind of like break down a few different kind of like archetypes or types of tracks that I guess that that you might come across in the kind of dance music world. The first of which is this idea of a DJ tool. So a DJ tool is kind of a piece of music that is kind of doing one thing throughout the course of a piece of music. It might be just like some drums for 4 minutes or something like that, where you have a simple idea that is being explored. And the reason it's kind of a DJ tool, the reason for the name, is that there are the way that the kind of musical creativity and the musical expression comes into this track is in the way that it's being used by the DJ to create something new. So it's about taking different pieces of music and making them sit alongside each other, playing them at the same time, manipulating them so that the resulting expression, the way that people hear it, is the result of the DJ working with these individual tracks. So the characteristics of this type of track, we have a very consistent energy level. It's kind of humming along at a consistent level. We've got enough change to stay interesting for several minutes at a time, but the variation is kind of minimal, right? We don't want big kind of drastic dynamic changes because that would make it kind of like unreliable and difficult to work with in this way of kind of, building something out of these component parts. We've got one specific musical or emotional idea that is going to be kind of fully explored in this piece of music. And as an example, this would be kind of like your typical techno track, right? Where you've got kind of some drums that are going to roll along and maybe like a synth line or a bass line, maybe one or two other elements. It's fairly minimal. The changes that happen throughout it aren't kind of huge and dramatic, but by getting multiple techno tracks alongside one another, somebody like, if you think about someone like Jeff Mills, right? DJing on like 4 turntables, he's taking elements of each of these tracks that are quite minimal, that are quite stripped back. He's taking elements of each of them and contextualizing them next to each other in a way that makes something new from these kind of fairly constrained pieces of music. Okay, so this is one type. Another type is something that I would call like a moment kind of track, where there is a particular section of the song that is really like definitive. Like if you remember this song, when you think about this song, you think about this song has that bit in it. And kind of like the whole piece of music is about delivering that one moment to the best, to the maximum kind of possible impact. So it has a particular standout section. It usually kind of starts fairly functional, fairly stripped back. And then we have our kind of contrasting section where the exciting or notable or novel thing happens, and then we go back to kind of being functional again at the end of the song. And the reason for that is that, like, like I mentioned before, we've got this kind of overlapping thing where you're not playing a song from the beginning all the way to the end and then starting the next song from the beginning. We've got, if this is our song, right, and this chunk in the middle is the exciting bit we want everyone to hear, then we need something at the start of it and something at the end of it to be the part that overlaps with the preceding song and the song that you play afterwards. So this is kind of like why we have this kind of like structure. And for an example of this type of track, like any song that's got like a big extended breakdown where the drums drop out and people stop dancing and there's some kind of emotional feeling. It might be euphoric, it might be oppressive or whatever, and then things break down and then they kind of build back up and we go back into a kind of typical sort of dance format. And then the third type that I sort of put in as an example here is kind of like a journey track. So this is the kind of track where you start in one place and you end somewhere else. So, well, there you go. So we are talking about some kind of transformation in the atmosphere, the vibe, the intensity, maybe the tempo. There is a point A where we start and a point B where we end, and the whole song is about traveling from A to B, and how do you make what are the changes that happen along the way. And so this is kind of about like making a conscious effort to, if we think about purpose and we think about context, this is about making a conscious effort to transform what's happening on the dance floor. So this might be, the dancing in the room might be quite sort of slow and swaying and people are kind of, shuffling around, and it might be quite laid back. And then we might play a track that kind of starts out that way, but sort of builds in intensity to get quite intense and quite banging by the end of it. And that has a particular effect that we're trying to achieve on the dance floor, right? Of getting people's energy up and making them start to dance, maybe more energetically or something like that. And this kind of track is a one of the ways that a DJ could do that. You could do that by playing different pieces of music in succession and things like that. But sometimes a DJ might want to say, okay, I know that I really like this journey that this track goes on, and I know that that's going to be appropriate for the vibe in the room right now and where I want to take it. So that's why I'm going to reach for this. I thought I'd put a fairly concrete, direct example for this one because it might not be immediately clear what I'm talking about. But XLB by Pearson Sound is like a UK techno track. Excuse me, and it starts out with this like pulsating, like kind of like really bassy, subby thing at the beginning with some fairly sparse rhythms and all these kind of like drippy, gloopy synths, and then in the middle section, everything drops out and it's just these synths and they kind of melt apart and they kind of all speed up and it all goes kind of like haywire and then it kind of breaks down. And then the end of the track is completely different from the beginning. And it's this like really kind of like pounding, sort of like jacking techno, sort of hard hitting, sort of stomping feeling thing going on. So we're starting in this kind of like more abstract, sort of pulsating vibe. We go into this kind of big breakdown with crazy sounds, and then at the end of the song, we are in like a high energy kind of like fist pumping sort of stomping your feet kind of dancey vibe. So we don't have time to play it unfortunately, but maybe make a note of that if you're interested in hearing what I mean by that. So those are some examples of different types of songs that you might encounter when we're thinking about kind of like categorizing different kinds of tracks and different purposes that they might fulfill. What are the things then that decide that dictate what purpose a track plays? What are the actual musical elements that makes something effective at doing one thing versus doing another. We've got musical content. So the first kind of thing would be like genre or style. Okay, if you think about a dubstep song versus a gosh, I don't know, a gabba song or something like that, right? You've got two very different genres of music, and songs composed within those genres are going to have different functions in terms of how they're played and how they're received on the dance floor. Saying that, even within a particular genre, you've got individual styles, right? So even within like drum and bass, you've got like jump up, which is all about kind of like the high intensity, big heavy drums, crazy bass lines. It's all about the kind of like the build up and the drop and the release, and the kind of like gun fingers in the air, like rude boy vibes and all that kind of thing, right? Where it's like high intensity and it's high energy. But then you've also got stuff like liquid D&B, where it's more about kind of like a vibe and an atmosphere, and you've got kind of like nice lush chords, and the rhythms are a bit kind of softer. You've got these kind of drum breaks, and it's more about kind of like locking into a groove and kind of flowing along with it. You know, the way that people dance to it is different. The way that DJs actually, you know, use tracks and play tracks and the types of tracks they play and all that kind of stuff changes. So yeah, even within genres, there are different stylistic considerations that change the way that people are going to interact with the track. We've got our kind of energy or our intensity level, and we're going to dive a bit deeper into this later on. But you know, we have if we're thinking about what purpose the track is going to play, energy is going to play into that massively, right? If we've got big distorted heavy drums and it's really rhythmic and intense, that's going to help the track to achieve you know, certain other things, more energetic dancing, all of that kind of stuff, versus something that might be softer and more introspective, that might be kind of like a bit more of a groover. You might be more kind of like about nodding your head and all of that kind of stuff. Like, this is all a reflection of the energy levels of the track. What else plays into the purpose? The mood and the emotion and the vibe. These kind of more subjective things, right? You could take the exact same drum sounds and synth sounds and samples and whatever, and depending on kind of like the chords you play or like the way that you play them, the way that you process them, things like that, you could make the same source materials sound uplifting and kind of euphoric, or you know, kind of like menacing and dark. And you know, if you think about kind of like a really kind of you know, bright sunny sounding like trance track versus a really kind of doomy, like sinister sounding trance track, like we've got very similar sounds happening, but the way that they're applied changes the emotion, changes the mood, and in so doing, that has the effect of the purpose changes. You know, you wouldn't, just because they're both trance songs, doesn't necessarily mean that you would might as well choose the euphoric one or the kind of dark menacing one for a given purpose, right? You're going to lean it towards one or the other, even though a lot of the kind of key characteristics are the same. That emotional content changes what purpose it's applicable to. The rhythmic feel is going to be a big one in terms of you know, hard hitting versus soft, or syncopated and groovy versus very rigid and kind of like tough, you know. We've got our melodic content tying into kind of like mood and emotion and things like that. You know, how does that feel to the listener? But also, we can think of it in terms of like a track that has lots of melody and has lots of harmony, has lots of chords, versus a track that's really stripped back and it's just drums, it's just rhythmic, it's just bass. Those are going to serve, you know, even if all the drums and the rhythms and the bass are the same underneath, you know, like with the, in fact, like with the example of that track that I sent to to Ben UFO, like I had this track where he liked what the rhythms and he liked what the percussion and he liked what the bass was doing, but I'd laid all of this melodic and chord information into this middle section that meant it wasn't fit for purpose anymore. And when I took that stuff out and sent him a new version of it and changed it up and things like that, that was the thing that kind of unlocked his interest and made it into something that he wanted to play. So not just thinking in terms of like how the melodic content sounds, but also how much of it there is. And then I believe, is that finally? I believe that is finally. And then how the track sounds. So all of this kind of sonic stuff. It might be kind of dusty and vintage and analog. That might suit a particular context, a particular type of venue or a particular type of audience, might make it play nice with certain styles of music, versus something that's really kind of like futuristic and digital and synthetic sounding. That's going to play, you know, even if all the rhythms and all the melodies and all the things are the same, changing that kind of sound aesthetic is going to have a big impact on how the song can be used, how it can be, the purposes that it can serve. And also the other kind of like major sort of not non-musical, but the other kind of consideration of what dictates the purpose of the track is structure. So this is our second point of the three things that that we need to know in order to give our songs a purpose and thereby get more plays from DJs.